A millionaire left his terminally ill wife for a glamorous younger woman, believing he was starting a better life. But when her will was read at the funeral, it revealed a secret no one saw coming. What she did in silence would not only ruin his plans, but redefine everything he thought he owned. The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the estate, stretching across polished marble floors and expensive Persian rugs. The air inside the mansion was quiet, save for the faint tick of the antique grandfather clock echoing down the corridor. Everything appeared perfect, every vase in its place, every cushion arranged just so, every hallway pristine and silent. But beneath that flawless surface, something had already begun to fracture. Julian Whitmore stood in his home office, a room dressed in mahogany and leather, staring blankly at the portfolio screen on his laptop. Stock charts moved in green and red waves. Figures fluctuated in real time, but his mind wasn't registering any of it. He tapped his pen on the glass tabletop, distracted, disconnected, vaguely irritated that the silence of the house was now heavier than usual. The mansion no longer felt alive. It felt sterile, too still. Outside, the Whitmore estate stretched for acres, a private driveway lined with towering oaks, a manicured rose garden, and a sparkling pool that glimmered like liquid sapphire. It was the kind of place that people only saw in magazines, the kind of life people envied. Yet, for Julian, the perfection of it all had begun to feel like a cage. In another wing of the house, Eleanor lay curled under a thick velvet blanket on a chaise in their sunroom, her skin pale and her eyes glassy. The morning light brushed her cheekbones, making her look almost ethereal, fragile but graceful, like a porcelain figurine. She used to love this room. It was her favorite spot in the house, where she read novels, sketched landscapes, or simply watched the seasons shift through the tall windows. But now, books remained untouched. Her sketchpad had dust. Even the fresh flowers that once adorned her side table had been replaced with sterile medication bottles and a glass of water. Julian hadn't kissed her forehead in weeks. He barely spoke unless necessary. Conversations had dwindled into logistical exchanges, prescriptions, doctor appointments, caretaker rotations. The warmth, the partnership, the intimacy, they had dissolved silently, quietly, like a forgotten melody fading into silence. "Mr. Whitmore," called the butler from the hallway, knocking softly. "Miss Evelyn is here. Should I bring her into the lounge?" Julian paused. A moment of hesitation flickered across his face before he nodded. "Yes, have her wait by the fire." He shut the laptop and stood, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored shirt, his mind shifting from market charts to lipstick-stained memories. Evelyn Hart. Young, magnetic, ambitious. She wasn't just his newest acquisition, she was a disruption. A beautiful, intoxicating disruption. Evelyn sat gracefully on the velvet settee in the lounge, her legs crossed, her manicured nails tapping softly against her phone. She wore a deep emerald dress that clung to her curves, and when she looked up to greet Julian, her smile was electric. "You look tired," she teased lightly, though her tone carried a hint of genuine observation. "I didn't sleep much," Julian replied as he poured 2 glasses of scotch, even though it was barely noon. Evelyn reached for her glass, brushing her fingers lightly against his as she took it. "Maybe you're starting to realize what you want can't be found in a spreadsheet." Julian chuckled quietly, though his eyes didn't reflect humor. He was still learning how to interpret Evelyn's words, whether they were flirtations, ambitions, or carefully veiled demands. She was younger by nearly 20 years, but she didn't act naive. She knew how to maneuver in a world built by men like Julian, and she wasn't shy about letting him know it. "Don't talk to me like I'm lost," he said, half serious. "Then stop looking like you are," she replied, crossing her legs again and leaning back. Their flirtation was constant, playful, but increasingly tangled in real consequences. Evelyn wasn't a secret anymore. Not really. Whispers had begun to circulate at social galas, business luncheons, charity auctions. People noticed when Eleanor stopped attending events. They noticed even more when Evelyn started showing up instead. Back in the sunroom, Eleanor turned her face slightly toward the door as she heard the muffled laughter drifting from the lounge. It wasn't the first time. She had stopped asking who was visiting long ago. Her questions had become burdensome to Julian, and she was too exhausted to chase answers that already cut too deep. Her nurse, a soft-spoken woman named Clara, walked in and gently adjusted the pillow behind Eleanor's head. "You need anything, ma'am?" she asked kindly. "No," Eleanor whispered, her voice dry and faint. "Just keep the doors closed." Clara nodded, understanding without needing more words. Eleanor closed her eyes again, listening to the sound of Evelyn's heels echoing faintly from across the house. The sound wasn't unfamiliar anymore. It was routine, predictable, insulting in its boldness. Later that evening, the dining table was set for two, though only Julian sat there. He ate alone, sipping wine between bites, scrolling through his phone as if searching for a better distraction than his own thoughts. Eleanor didn't join him for dinner anymore. He'd stopped asking her weeks ago, but as he raised his fork, his phone buzzed. A message from Evelyn. "Thinking about you. Next time, let's not wait till the weekend." A smile crept onto his face, one that hadn't surfaced at home in a long time. He responded quickly, almost instinctively. "Tomorrow night. Book something private." Meanwhile, in the quiet of her room, Eleanor sat by the window, her hands clasped over her lap. She stared out at the garden, now dark and still. A distant cough escaped her lips, her body frail beneath her robe, but her eyes held a quiet intensity. She had never been the dramatic type, never the kind to beg or plead. But she wasn't blind either. She saw it all. Every lie, every absence, every dinner for two that turned into one. And now, she was beginning to plan. That night, Julian stood in front of his bathroom mirror, brushing his teeth, his mind drifting. He imagined Evelyn in his bed, in his arms, in his future. He had convinced himself this was his new life beginning. A second act, a renaissance of youth, freedom, and passion. He didn't see what he was losing. Not yet. Across the hall, Eleanor sat at her writing desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper inside was aged, delicate, but its contents were timeless. She reread the lines she had written weeks ago, her eyes lingering on the final sentence. She folded the letter, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it in the bottom drawer beneath a stack of documents labeled simply, Whitmore Foundation. The night deepened. The mansion fell silent again. But this time, beneath that silence, something else was rising. A shift, a pulse, a quiet resolve building in the shadows. And far across the city, Evelyn lay in her apartment bed, staring at the ceiling, a smug smile on her lips as she checked her messages again. She thought she was winning. She hadn't seen the storm quietly gathering in the place she had already discarded. Before we continue, I want to know, if you were in her shoes, what would you have done? Tell us in the comments right now. And if this story already got your attention, give it a like, rate it from 0 to 10 so far, and don't forget to subscribe. The best part is still coming. The sound of rain tapping against the wide windows filled the dim bedroom where Eleanor lay in silence, the soft rhythm matching the faint beep of the monitor at her bedside. Outside, the garden looked hazy, each droplet painting streaks across the glass like an impressionist's brush. Her body, once vibrant and full of energy, now seemed delicate and hollow, like a porcelain vase drained of color. The air in the room was heavy with a blend of floral oils and antiseptics, a strange mixture of beauty and decay. On the nightstand, a framed photo of her and Julian from a gala years ago tilted slightly, the smiles in it brighter than anything that remained between them now. Eleanor didn't sleep much anymore. Her nights were fragmented, half-dreams interrupted by pain, coughing fits, or just the crushing weight of realization that she was slowly slipping away. Clara, her nurse, came in every few hours with gentle hands and soft-spoken reassurances, but nothing really soothed the ache that came from the quiet abandonment she felt more than any physical pain. Julian had been absent most of the day again. He'd left early, as he usually did now, mumbling something about meetings and business calls. She didn't even ask anymore. It had become predictable, his calendar full of vague appointments that somehow always coincided with Evelyn's schedule. She stared at the ceiling, letting her thoughts drift to memories that felt like borrowed time. She remembered when Julian used to run his fingers through her hair, whispering ideas about their future late into the night. She remembered weekend getaways, wine by the fireplace, the way he used to watch her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. Now, he barely looked her in the eye. He didn't notice the way her hands shook when she reached for her water, or how her voice had grown thinner, like the fading thread of a worn fabric. In the kitchen downstairs, the staff worked in silence, preparing a breakfast that no one would eat together. Julian had already left in his black sports car, not bothering to leave a note. He had started spending more time at his downtown office, a sleek space that felt more like a bachelor's retreat than a place of business. It was where he met Evelyn most days. They'd grown careless. Or maybe he just didn't care if Eleanor knew anymore. He assumed she was too weak to confront him, too fragile to react. What he didn't realize was that she noticed everything, and though she didn't speak of it, every moment of neglect etched itself into her memory like a final testament of his betrayal. Eleanor's sister, Meredith, came by that afternoon, carrying a basket of herbal teas and soft pastries from Eleanor's favorite cafe. She tried to brighten the room with her usual optimism, but her face paled when she saw her sister's condition. "You're thinner," she said gently, brushing Eleanor's cheek. "Are you eating at all?" Eleanor gave a small smile. "I eat when I feel like it. Most days I don't feel much of anything." Meredith sat beside her, holding her hand. "Julian should be here more," she said carefully, not wanting to inflame wounds, but unable to ignore the elephant in the room. "He's your husband. He's busy." Eleanor interrupted softly, though her eyes held a glint of irony. "Business is demanding." Meredith hesitated. "You're too kind to him. You always have been." Eleanor looked out the window again. "It doesn't matter anymore." That night, Julian returned late. His tie was loose, his eyes slightly glazed from too many drinks. He paused in the hallway outside Eleanor's door, hand hovering over the doorknob before pulling it back. He didn't want to see her like that. Not sick, not diminished. He preferred to remember her as she had been, strong, elegant, sharp. The version of Eleanor that stood beside him at high society events, not the woman lying in a dim room, fading quietly each day. He turned and walked to his study instead, poured himself another drink, and texted Evelyn, "Tomorrow. Same place. Can't wait to see you." Evelyn replied within seconds, already counting down. In bed, Eleanor turned her head toward the hallway, sensing his brief presence there, though he never stepped inside. She didn't cry. She didn't call for him. She simply closed her eyes and reached for her notebook, the one she kept hidden beneath her pillow. Inside it, pages filled with thoughts, names, instructions, plans. The next morning, Julian woke early and left again before sunrise. The mansion felt colder than usual, emptier, despite its grandeur. He didn't kiss Eleanor's forehead. He didn't stop to check on her. He drove straight to Evelyn's penthouse, where she greeted him in silk robes and a smirk that made him feel wanted in a way he hadn't in years. They had breakfast by her large bay window, overlooking the city skyline. "I don't know why you haven't moved on yet," Evelyn said casually as she stirred her coffee. "You've already left her in every way that matters." Julian sighed. "It's not that simple." "It is," she said, leaning in. "You're just afraid of what people might say. But people forget. They always do." He looked at her, his fingers tightening slightly around the cup. "Soon," he said quietly. "Soon I'll make it official." Evelyn smiled and leaned in to kiss him, her lips brushing his ear. "Then we'll finally have the life we deserve." Back at the estate, Eleanor sat with Clara, who was reading her a letter from the doctor about her treatment plan. Eleanor wasn't listening anymore. She stared instead at the fireplace, the flickering flames casting shadows across her face. "Clara," she said softly, interrupting her. "I want to update my files today." Clara nodded. "Of course. Do you want me to call Mr. Whitmore's office?" "No," Eleanor said quickly. "Call Mr. Redmond, my personal attorney." There was a finality in her voice that left no room for discussion. Later that afternoon, Mr. Redmond arrived, briefcase in hand, his graying hair neatly combed, his eyes sharp behind rectangular glasses. Eleanor greeted him with warmth, despite the fatigue in her eyes. They spoke for over an hour behind closed doors, documents spread across her lap, signatures carefully placed, instructions rewritten. When they finished, she handed him an envelope. "Deliver this when the time comes," she said, her voice steady. "And not a moment before." Redmond nodded solemnly. "Understood." As he left, Julian's car pulled up the driveway, the wheels crunching against gravel. He walked past Redmond without a glance, too preoccupied with a phone call. Eleanor heard the footsteps, heard the sound of the door opening and closing. Still, he didn't come to her room. She waited, even though she knew better. Later, She found his jacket draped on the back of a chair in the hallway. She reached into the pocket and found a receipt from a luxury restaurant, 2 entrees, a bottle of wine, and a note scribbled at the bottom in Evelyn's handwriting. "Until tomorrow, love." Eleanor folded the receipt quietly and walked back to her room. She placed it in her notebook, right next to her plans. There was no anger in her hands, no trembling rage, just resolve. Julian was already in the lounge, glass in hand, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. He thought he had already left his wife in everything but name. He had no idea that she had already left him in every way that mattered. She just hadn't told him yet. The scent of fresh lilies filled the grand foyer as Julian stepped into the mansion later that evening, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a muffled thud. He paused for a moment, inhaling deeply as if to ground himself before continuing toward the lounge. The house was silent, as it often was now, but not in a way that invited peace. It was the kind of silence that amplified every footstep, every breath, every thought that lingered too long. The kind of silence that had once made him feel powerful, now only made him feel watched. He poured himself a glass of scotch from the decanter and sat in his usual chair, but his mind was already elsewhere. Evelyn had called twice that day, once to ask what time he'd be picking her up for the art gala. The second time, to suggest they stop hiding and go public with their relationship. She was getting impatient, and Julian couldn't blame her. He had promised her change, a future, a life far removed from the shadows of secrecy. But somehow, every time he looked at Eleanor, even as she lay frail and withdrawn, he hesitated. Not from guilt. That had long evaporated. It was something more complex, something he couldn't yet name. Across town, Evelyn stood in front of her full-length mirror, adjusting a diamond necklace around her neck. Her dress was a deep crimson silk that hugged her figure with precision. Her lips, painted the same shade, curled slightly as she admired her reflection. The woman staring back at her wasn't just a lover in hiding anymore. She was preparing for something bigger. Evelyn had played her role well, companion, confidant, escape. But now, she wanted the title. She wanted the mansion, the public acknowledgement, the life of a millionaire's wife. And she had no patience for delay. The art gala was the perfect opportunity. The event was filled with socialites, investors, politicians, and media. Every corner held a camera, a whisper, a headline waiting to happen. Julian hesitated at first when she suggested he bring her, but Evelyn had a way of convincing without begging. That was one of the things he admired about her. She never cried, never pouted. She simply planted ideas and watched them grow in his mind like vines wrapping around his logic. And so, reluctantly, he agreed. At the gala, Evelyn walked beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm as photographers snapped pictures and guests exchanged curious glances. It didn't take long for murmurs to spread. Some people nodded politely, others raised their brows in silent judgment. But Julian remained composed, offering stiff smiles and calculated small talk. Evelyn, on the other hand, flourished. She greeted people with poise, spoke eloquently about the art installations, laughed at the right moments. She belonged in that world, and she made sure everyone noticed. Later that night, back in the mansion, Julian poured himself another drink as Evelyn wandered the halls, taking in the opulence. Her heels clicked against the marble floors, echoing off the high ceilings. She paused by the grand piano, tracing her fingers along the polished keys. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice distant. "It feels empty, though." Julian didn't answer. He stared into his glass, the amber liquid swirling like a vortex. "It's just a house," he finally said. Evelyn turned to him, studying his face. "Is that why you haven't asked her to leave yet?" "Because it's just a house." He met her gaze, unflinching. "She's dying. And you're living," Evelyn replied without hesitation. "You deserve more than this half-life." He didn't respond. The conversation hung in the air, unresolved, floating like smoke between them. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep in the guest room. She slept in Julian's bed, a quiet conquest that went unspoken but fully understood. The next morning, Eleanor sat on the veranda, wrapped in a thick shawl as the sun peeked over the trees. She sipped her tea slowly, her gaze fixed on the garden path. Clara brought her a tray of warm pastries, but Eleanor didn't touch them. She seemed distracted, her mind elsewhere. She had heard the laughter last night, muffled footsteps in the hallway, the soft creak of the door across from hers. She didn't need to see Evelyn to know she was there. Clara tried to lighten the mood with gentle conversation, but Eleanor remained distant. "Call Mr. Redmond again," she said suddenly. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Clara asked, concern in her voice. "I want to finalize the foundation paperwork. No more delays." Clara nodded and left to make the call, her steps brisk. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the morning sun warming her face. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in weeks. Pain had become part of her daily rhythm, and betrayal was just another piece of the symphony. Julian entered the dining room later that day and found Eleanor already seated. It was the first time in weeks they had crossed paths in that room. He hesitated for a moment, surprised to see her there. She looked thinner, paler, but her eyes still held that calm, unreadable depth he had always found both unsettling and beautiful. "You're up early," he said casually. "I couldn't sleep," she replied. An awkward silence settled between them, broken only by the clink of silverware. Julian avoided her gaze. She didn't press him. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked softly. He looked up, startled. "About what?" "Her." Julian froze, then quickly composed himself. "There's nothing to talk about." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." She stood and walked away, leaving her tea untouched. Julian remained seated, the taste of shame creeping into his mouth, even though he'd long convinced himself he felt none. That evening, Evelyn returned to the mansion again, this time dressed casually, as if she belonged there. She made herself a drink in the kitchen, kissed Julian on the cheek, and asked what time dinner would be. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Evelyn was no longer visiting. She was establishing presence, staking territory. Julian didn't stop her. He didn't even think about what it meant. He just let it happen. But not everyone was blind to the transition. The staff began to notice changes. Evelyn's personal items started appearing in the master suite. Her perfume lingered in the air. Her voice echoed in hallways where Eleanor's had once been the only melody. One of the housekeepers quietly whispered to another, "It's like she's already replaced her." But the other one, "She's still breathing." Late one night, Julian stood by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the lawn. Evelyn wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about what she'll leave behind?" she asked. Julian shrugged. "She doesn't have much anymore. Just memories." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Well then, I guess we'll be building everything new." But in the guest room, beneath the floorboard Eleanor had once lifted carefully in the early hours of a sleepless night, lay a box. Inside were documents, letters, and something Evelyn hadn't accounted for. Something Julian had long overlooked. A future neither of them would see coming. The house was still quiet, but the silence was shifting. Not a void anymore, more like a whisper beneath the surface. A foundation already being poured beneath their feet, one brick at a time, for a legacy that none of them understood yet. And as Evelyn curled beside Julian that night, her head resting on his chest, the woman down the hall lay in bed, eyes open in the dark, her mind sharper than ever. Her body was fading, but her will had never been clearer. She had already begun to write the ending of a story they believed they were authoring. The days were beginning to blur into each other, stitched together by hushed footsteps, whispered conversations, and the occasional rustle of paper in the otherwise silent halls of the Whitmore estate. Outside, autumn had begun to settle in, painting the trees with burnt oranges and tired golds. The wind carried a different scent now, something crisp, almost melancholic. It was the kind of air that made people feel nostalgic without knowing why. Inside the mansion, however, the weather seemed irrelevant. Time felt suspended, caught between the past and something undefined, something quietly approaching. Eleanor spent most of her hours in the study now, a place she hadn't used much since the early years of their marriage. The room had always belonged to Julian. The polished walnut desk, the leather armchair, the bookshelves lined with unread classics chosen more for aesthetic than for content. But now it was Eleanor who occupied the space, her presence transforming it into something entirely different. Stacks of folders were neatly arranged across the desk, along with several envelopes labeled with her careful handwriting. Each morning, she would sit in the armchair and work methodically, going through bank documents, old contracts, and business portfolios. Julian had long dismissed her involvement in their financial matters. assuming she was either uninterested or incapable. He had no idea how deeply she had remained involved behind the scenes, managing trusts, understanding asset transfers, and maintaining access to crucial accounts. Eleanor had always believed that true strength was quiet, subtle, almost invisible. Now, she was ready to use it. One morning, Clara walked in to bring her medication and found Eleanor buried in legal documents, her eyes scanning each line with a quiet intensity. "Should I come back later?" Clara asked, gently placing the pill container on the desk. Eleanor shook her head without looking up. "No, I'm almost done here," she replied softly, circling a clause with a red pen. "Would you mind calling Mr. Redmond again? I'd like him to come by this afternoon." Clara nodded and stepped out of the room, already familiar with Eleanor's tone when she was resolved. She never raised her voice, never acted in haste, but when she made decisions, there was an unmistakable finality to them. A few hours later, Mr. Redmond arrived with his usual composed demeanor, dressed in a navy suit and carrying a briefcase that had grown heavier with each visit. They met in the sunroom this time. Eleanor, despite her weakening body, sat upright, her spine straight, her eyes sharp. "I've outlined everything," she began, pushing a thick folder toward him. "The foundation will be established in my name, under the bylaws we discussed. I've assigned the initial board members, and the charitable mission has been clearly defined. It should be enough to satisfy the legal prerequisites for nonprofit registration." Mr. Redmond reviewed the documents silently, nodding slowly as he turned each page. "And the estate?" he asked without looking up. "Transferred," she answered. "Every property, every account, every asset I had access to before the marriage contracts were modified." He may have thought I was distracted, but he never noticed the small changes. A percentage here, a shift of ownership there. "It's all in the foundation now." Redmond raised his eyes, clearly impressed. "He's going to be very surprised." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's not the point. This isn't about revenge. This is about legacy. He traded me for youth, for lust, for convenience. But what he forgot is that my value was never measured by his affection." She paused and glanced toward the window, where the last leaves clung desperately to the trees. "I built this life beside him. I made sacrifices. I stood in the shadows so he could stand in the spotlight. But I was never invisible. I just chose to stay quiet, until now." Redmond nodded and slid the folder into his briefcase. "You've done something extraordinary here, Eleanor. This foundation will outlive us both." "That's the plan," she replied. "And when the time comes, I want the announcement to go public. But not a moment before. Not until the will is read. He must hear it with everyone else. I want him to learn the truth not through whispers, but through law." Redmond understood. There was a power in silence, but there was a greater power in timing. He stood to leave, offering her a gentle nod. "I'll see to everything." "Thank you," she said, and as he walked away, she leaned back in her chair, exhaustion finally catching up to her. Her body ached, but her mind was calm. She had done what needed to be done. Later that evening, Julian returned to the mansion after a long day filled with back-to-back meetings, though none of them held his attention the way Evelyn did. His conversations were mechanical, his smiles forced, his mind always drifting to her, her voice, her scent, her laughter echoing in his head like a hypnotic melody. He found Evelyn in the lounge, curled up with a glass of wine and a novel she wasn't really reading. "You're late," she said, pretending to pout. "Work," he replied, kissing her forehead. "That's always your excuse." "Well, now I have more reasons to leave it behind," he murmured, slipping his arm around her waist. "I want to take you away soon. Somewhere far. Just us." She turned to him, eyes shining. "Then make it happen." Upstairs, Eleanor sat by the fireplace in her bedroom, the flames casting soft shadows across her face. She was holding a photograph, one from their early days. They were young, laughing, her arms wrapped around Julian's neck, his eyes looking at her like she was his entire world. She studied it for a long time, not out of longing, but out of understanding. She wasn't grieving the man he had become. She was honoring the woman she had been. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. It was Clara, holding a small wooden box. "This was in the study. I thought you might want it." Eleanor took the box and opened it slowly. Inside were keepsakes, an old watch Julian had gifted her, a dried rose from their first anniversary, a note he once wrote on a hotel napkin, promising her forever. She smiled sadly, then closed the box and set it aside. Some memories were worth keeping. Others were worth burying. She stood and walked slowly to the safe in her closet, entering the combination with fingers that trembled slightly. Inside, she placed the final set of documents, sealed, labeled, precise. She locked the safe and stepped back, exhaling deeply. The quiet goodbye had already begun. Not with tears, not with words, but with preparation. Julian believed he was building a new life, one that eclipsed the old. But Eleanor wasn't clinging to the past. She was shaping the future. And when the final moment came, he wouldn't even see it coming. He'd think it was grief, but it would be justice wrapped in grace. She closed her eyes that night with a peace she hadn't felt in years. Not because the pain had eased, but because she finally understood that she had nothing left to lose and everything left to leave behind. The morning sun poured over the sleek lines of Julian Whitmore's sports car as it pulled into the driveway of his downtown penthouse. It wasn't the family estate he had shared with Eleanor, but rather a new, modern space built for appearances. Minimalist decor, chrome surfaces, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the skyline but hid everything else. Julian liked it that way. Clean, cold, uncomplicated. A reflection of the life he believed he now deserved. Evelyn had moved in the previous week, her belongings slowly taking over every corner. Her perfume lingered in the bathroom, her silk robes hung in the closet beside his tailored suits, and her high heels lined the hallway floor like trophies of conquest. She was radiant, energetic, and everything Eleanor no longer was. At least, that's how Julian chose to see it. They woke late that morning, tangled in soft linen sheets, her laughter echoing through the open space as she recounted a dream she'd had about them vacationing on a yacht in Santorini. Julian smiled, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about his meeting with his accountant later that afternoon, a routine check-in on his investments, property distributions, and a few asset transitions he had initiated after deciding to start his life anew. Evelyn leaned across him, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "You're distracted," she teased. "Am I boring you already?" He shook his head and kissed her forehead. "Just work stuff. Nothing serious." But it was serious. He had begun to feel uneasy ever since his last call with Charles, the accountant who had managed his financial empire for over a decade. There had been something in Charles's voice, an uncertainty, a hesitation, that Julian couldn't ignore. It was unlike him to stumble over figures or request additional time to locate documentation. Something wasn't aligning, and that made Julian restless. Still, he brushed the thought aside as Evelyn poured him coffee and slid onto the kitchen island, crossing her legs with casual elegance. "When are we going back to the estate?" she asked, sipping from her cup. "It's too beautiful to leave empty." Julian looked up from his tablet. "Soon. There's just a bit more to finalize before we move everything." Evelyn tilted her head. "You mean before you kick your wife out?" He narrowed his eyes slightly. "Don't call her that. It's not that simple. She's not dead yet," Evelyn said bluntly. "But she will be. And you need to decide what happens next." Julian didn't respond immediately. He stood, adjusted his cufflinks, and grabbed his blazer. "I'll be back later," he said. "Try not to redesign the place while I'm gone." Evelyn smiled. "No promises." As he stepped into the elevator, a cold breeze from the ventilation system swept over him, making him feel strangely uneasy again. He dismissed it, attributing it to the residual guilt he hadn't fully acknowledged. At the accounting firm, Charles greeted him with the usual professional formality, though something in his demeanor was more tense than usual. They sat in a glass-walled office, overlooking the financial district. Charles opened a file and cleared his throat. "Julian, I've been reviewing the updated portfolio, and there are discrepancies. A number of assets that were once under your personal account have either been transferred or no longer reflect your ownership." Julian frowned. "Transferred where?" Charles hesitated. "That's the thing. The documents suggest that the transfers began gradually over the last 12 months. Minor shifts at first, changes in beneficiary designations, adjustments in title ownership. Nothing that raised red flags initially. But now, several properties, a few offshore accounts, and a portion of your liquid assets are showing up under a different entity." Julian leaned forward. "What entity?" "The Whitmore Legacy Foundation." There was a long pause. Julian blinked, stunned. "A foundation? What foundation? I didn't authorize anything like that." Charles slid a document across the table. It was registered 6 months ago. And according to these papers, your wife is listed as the founder and primary trustee. Julian stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. Eleanor's handwriting. Elegant, precise, deliberate. She's been transferring assets this entire time? Legally, yes. And subtly. It was meticulously done through trusts, rollovers, and irrevocable designations. Everything's airtight. Julian felt a chill rise up his spine. He'd always believed Eleanor had withdrawn from the business side of their life long ago, content to let him handle everything. But now, he saw it differently. She hadn't withdrawn. She had watched. Waited. Calculated. He ran a hand over his face, leaning back in the chair. Can it be reversed? Charles shook his head, not without contesting it in court. And with her deteriorating health, doing so might not reflect well on you, especially if the foundation becomes public knowledge. Julian stood abruptly, buttoning his blazer. I need time to think. Of course, Charles said, but there was pity in his eyes. Julian hated pity. On the drive home, he gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, the engine humming beneath him like a heartbeat out of sync. His thoughts spiraled. Eleanor had fooled him. She had planned something massive right under his nose. And worst of all, he had been too consumed by Evelyn's laughter and youthful glow to see any of it happening. When he entered the penthouse, Evelyn was lounging on the couch, flipping through a design catalog. You look like hell, she said, not looking up. Julian poured himself a drink, his hands shaking slightly. We have a problem. What now? Eleanor, he said through gritted teeth. She's moved most of the assets. They're not mine anymore. Evelyn stared at him. What do you mean not yours? You're the millionaire. You built everything. Apparently not well enough. She set up a foundation. It's legally binding. It's all in her name now. Evelyn stood slowly, processing his words. So what are you saying? That she stole everything? No, he replied bitterly. She outsmarted me. Evelyn's face tightened. So what happens to us now? What happens to this life you promised me? Julian didn't answer. For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer. He looked out the window at the city skyline, once a symbol of his dominance, now just a wall of distant lights mocking his blindness. Somewhere across that skyline, in a quiet room filled with shadows and soft whispers, Eleanor sat by the fireplace again, a journal in her lap, a gentle smile on her lips. She didn't need to rush the final act. Everything was already in motion. The foundation had been born not from vengeance, but from clarity. And while Julian tried to salvage the pieces of the empire he once thought he ruled, Eleanor was already building something far greater. Something untouchable. Something eternal. The wind carried a different weight now, not just the chill of the changing season, but something else, something harder to describe. A heaviness that clung to the walls of the Whitmore estate and settled into every crevice like dust no one could sweep away. The rose garden had lost its bloom, the once vibrant petals now drooping under the weight of early frost. The staff moved more quietly, conversations whispered behind doors, footsteps gentler than ever, as if they feared disturbing the fragile thread that still tethered Eleanor Whitmore to the world around her. Her condition had declined quickly in the past few weeks. The fatigue was no longer occasional, it was constant. Her breath, once steady, now came in shallow draws, and her once graceful hands trembled even when holding the lightest cup of tea. Yet, despite it all, her mind remained clear, sharp, deliberate. Her thoughts didn't drift like her body did. They marched forward with purpose. Eleanor had long since accepted the inevitability of her path, but what she refused to do was fade without leaving something behind. Her days became a balance of physical struggle and quiet strategy. Each morning, she would sit in the sunroom wrapped in thick blankets, her notebook in her lap, reviewing every detail of the foundation's future. Board member lists, grant proposals, timelines for funding, nothing escaped her attention. She knew that once she was gone, everything would fall into motion, and she wanted no room for error. She had spent years watching Julian build his empire, feeding his ego while operating in his shadow. But she wouldn't leave the world silently. She wouldn't be remembered as just the wife he left behind. She would be remembered for something bigger. Clara sat beside her on most days, tending to her with silent loyalty. The nurse had become more than just a caregiver. She was a quiet witness to everything Eleanor had endured, the betrayal, the illness, the transformation. You don't have to review those papers again, Clara said gently one afternoon, placing a fresh blanket over Eleanor's lap. You've already gone through them 3 times this week. Eleanor smiled faintly, her lips pale but still composed. I just want to make sure everything's perfect. There's no room for almost when you're rewriting your legacy. Clara nodded, though the sadness in her eyes was undeniable. She admired Eleanor's strength, even when it came at the cost of comfort, even when it meant fighting battles no one else could see. Would you like me to read some letters today? She asked, motioning to the stack of envelopes Eleanor had been preparing. Not yet, Eleanor replied. Some of them are meant to be read when I'm no longer here. Some are for closure. Others are reminders. Julian hadn't visited in nearly a week. He'd made excuses, citing business, meetings, delays in the divorce proceedings, though they both knew those were just masks for avoidance. The truth was simpler. He couldn't bear to watch her fade. And even more, he couldn't handle the guilt that lingered every time he saw her eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at him with hope, with love, now watching him with quiet detachment. But Eleanor no longer needed him to show up. She wasn't waiting anymore. She had already said her goodbye to the man he used to be. The rest was just noise. On a particularly cold afternoon, Meredith arrived with a wool scarf and homemade soup. She tried to hide her tears behind laughter and stories, but Eleanor saw through it. They sat together near the fire, Meredith's hand clasping Eleanor's as they watched the flames dance. I wish he'd come see you, Meredith said after a long pause. Eleanor sipped her tea slowly, her voice soft but unwavering. He made his choice. He chose absence. I chose grace. That evening, Eleanor penned her final letters. One for Clara, one for Meredith, and one for Julian. She wrote each one by hand, her script elegant and precise, even as her fingers strained to hold the pen. She sealed each envelope carefully, labeling them with a name and a date. Julian's letter was different. It wasn't bitter, nor was it filled with accusations. It was a portrait of the woman he had forgotten. It told the story of a love that had once bloomed under laughter and shared dreams, then slowly died beneath the weight of ego and betrayal. It didn't beg for forgiveness, nor did it offer it. It simply told the truth. And sometimes, that was the heaviest letter of all. As she folded the final page, she tucked it into an envelope and placed it in the safe, alongside the revised will and foundation documents. She had instructed Redmond that these items were to be delivered the moment the doctor signed her death certificate. Not before, not a second earlier. Her timing, like everything else she had done, was precise. Meanwhile, across town, Julian stood in the conference room of a new development project, surrounded by architects and investors, distracted and distant. He was supposed to be closing on a property deal, but his mind wandered. He felt it again, that restlessness, that sense that something was unraveling just beyond his reach. Evelyn noticed the change in him. She watched the way he stared at nothing, how his answers came slower, how his grip on his wineglass was tighter than usual at dinner parties. You're not here, she told him one night, sitting across from him at a lavish rooftop restaurant. Your body's here, but your mind's still stuck in that house. She's dying, Julian said after a long silence. And somehow, she still has more control than I do. Evelyn leaned back, her face unreadable. Then maybe you should figure out who you are without her. But Julian wasn't sure who that man was anymore. Without Eleanor's structure, her silent guidance, her quiet brilliance, he wasn't just lost. He was hollow. Back at the estate, Eleanor requested one final visit from her legal team. Redmond arrived the following morning, greeted her respectfully, and sat beside her as she went over final adjustments. I need you to promise me something, she said, her voice weaker than ever. Anything. When the time comes, don't allow him to contest the foundation. Don't let him twist it into a scandal. Let the papers speak for themselves. I will, Redmond replied. And I'll make sure the first press release honors you the way you deserve. It's not about me, she whispered. It's about purpose. That night, Eleanor asked Clara to open the window beside her bed. The cold air rushed in, crisp and sharp, but she welcomed it. She stared at the stars, the sky cloudless, the world vast. She remembered the first night Julian had brought her to that house. He had promised her the stars. She had believed him. And now, in the silence of her last days, she finally understood that the stars had always been hers. Not because of what he gave her, but because of who she had always been. And somewhere in the city, Julian sat in his penthouse, staring out at those same stars, unaware that while he searched for clarity in the distance, the woman he had left behind had already built an entire world in his absence. A world he could no longer reach, no longer touch, and would never truly understand, until it was far too late. The day of the funeral arrived cloaked in a heavy, gray sky that hung low over the estate like a sorrowful veil. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and wilting flowers, and the wind carried a stillness that silenced even the birds. It wasn't raining, but the atmosphere held the weight of something that should have been, a slow, quiet grief that didn't need tears to be felt. The driveway was lined with parked black cars, their hoods glistening under the overcast light, while distant murmurs floated between guests in hushed tones. Eleanor Whitmore's farewell had drawn a larger crowd than expected. Friends, acquaintances, business associates, even a few distant relatives who hadn't spoken to her in years now appeared, dressed in somber elegance, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses, their condolences spoken in rehearsed sympathies. The ceremony was held in the garden Eleanor had once tended to herself, back when her hands were strong enough to dig into the soil and plant each flower with care. Now, those same hands were still, tucked beneath the white silk lining of a mahogany casket resting beneath the archway of roses she had planted so many springs ago. The irony wasn't lost on a few of the guests, who whispered to one another about the contrast. The woman who had been so full of life now surrounded by what she herself had nurtured into bloom. Julian stood near the front, his face a practiced mask of solemnity. He wore a tailored black suit, his hair slicked back, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. His posture was stiff, and his hands remained clasped behind his back, not out of reverence, but to suppress the restlessness that had been growing in him since dawn. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching the motions of grief play out before him like a performance he had no real part in. Beside him stood Evelyn, dressed in a modest black dress with a matching veil, her presence a subtle scandal to those who noticed. Some guests stared, others whispered, but Julian made no effort to conceal her anymore. He had convinced himself this day was a formality, a closing chapter, nothing more. He had already moved on, or so he told himself. As the minister spoke, reading a passage Eleanor had selected months prior, Julian's mind drifted. He wasn't listening to the words. He was watching the people, studying their faces, trying to decipher what they were thinking. Were they pitying him? Judging him? Were they comparing Evelyn to Eleanor? He felt eyes on him from every direction, yet none of them offered comfort. He looked around and saw Meredith sitting quietly a few rows behind, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together. Clara was beside her, holding a small bouquet of white lilies, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Julian avoided their gaze. When the ceremony ended, guests slowly approached the casket to pay their final respects. One by one, they placed flowers, said quiet goodbyes, and exchanged sorrowful nods. Evelyn remained slightly behind Julian, not wanting to draw more attention than she already had. She watched as people passed, her expression unreadable. Some offered her polite nods, others glanced away entirely. She didn't care. In her mind, this was a formality before the life she had been promised finally began. She had already envisioned the future, the estate becoming hers, the lifestyle uninterrupted, the story rewritten with her at the center. But something about the day unsettled her. The atmosphere felt heavier than it should. The expressions on some guests' faces weren't just grief. They were curious, almost expectant, as if everyone was waiting for something else to happen. Something more. Julian noticed it too. The glances, the quiet murmurs, the way people lingered after the ceremony had ended. It wasn't just mourning, it was anticipation. And then, just as he was about to leave, Mr. Redmond approached him, his face solemn, his hands clutching a sealed folder. "Julian," he said, his voice low, "I'd like a moment of your time. It's regarding Eleanor's final wishes." Julian nodded, slightly irritated. "Can't this wait until tomorrow?" "She was very specific," Redmond said. "The reading of the will must happen today. She wanted all beneficiaries present, immediately following the funeral." Julian's brows furrowed. "Why? That's highly unusual." "And yet," Redmond replied, offering no further explanation, Everyone's been notified. We've arranged a private gathering in the drawing room. Julian sighed and turned to Evelyn, who gave him a questioning look. We have to stay, he said. Apparently, she had a flair for dramatics after all. Evelyn shrugged. Fine, let's get it over with. Back at the estate, the drawing room had been prepared with chairs arranged in a semicircle and a polished oak table at the front, upon which Redmond placed a stack of documents and a thick envelope marked with Eleanor's signature. The atmosphere was tense. Guests shuffled in, whispering among themselves, some clearly uncomfortable with the sudden transition from grief to legal matters. Julian took a seat at the front, Evelyn beside him, her posture straight, her gaze sharp. Redmond cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. As per Mrs. Whitmore's instructions, I will now proceed with the reading of her last will and testament. A hush fell over the room. The only sound was the flicker of the fireplace and the distant rustle of wind through the trees outside. Redmond began reading the formalities, the standard preamble, declarations of sound mind, and legal language that meant little to most in the room. Then, he began naming specific bequests. To Clara, a substantial sum and a letter of gratitude. To Meredith, several personal belongings and shares in a small trust fund. To various charities, notable donations. And then, the room shifted. Redmond continued. As for the remainder of my estate, including all properties, financial assets, business shares, and intellectual holdings, I hereby confirm their full and irrevocable transfer to the Whitmore Legacy Foundation, registered in my name and established 6 months prior. All assets have been reassigned, and the foundation is now the sole beneficiary of my estate. Gasps rippled through the room. Julian blinked, stunned. What? He said aloud, his voice louder than intended. Redmond didn't look at him. He simply continued reading. I have ensured the legal transfer of all holdings during my lifetime. As such, this will is a mere formality. The foundation will operate independently, with no legal obligation to distribute any benefits to my surviving spouse or his affiliates. Evelyn turned sharply to Julian. Is this some kind of joke? Julian's face had gone pale. I don't understand. She planned this, Evelyn hissed. She took everything. It's not possible, Julian muttered. There must be a mistake. Redmond finally looked up. There is no mistake, Mr. Whitmore. Your wife was meticulous. Everything is already in motion. And just like that, the room exploded into a storm of whispers, disbelief, and awkward glances. Some guests hid their smirks behind handkerchiefs. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The man they had once admired, envied, even feared, was now exposed. The millionaire left with nothing but titles and illusions. Julian sat frozen in his chair, his hands limp in his lap. Evelyn stood abruptly, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. You said everything would be ours, she spat. You promised me this life. I didn't know, he replied weakly. I didn't know you knew nothing. Evelyn interrupted, grabbing her purse and storming out of the room. And in that moment, the truth settled in. Eleanor's legacy wasn't just in the assets she redirected or the foundation she created. It was in the silence with which she dismantled everything he had built, piece by piece, while he thought she was fading. She hadn't left quietly. She had simply waited for the perfect moment to speak the loudest. And now, with everyone watching, Julian finally realized that she had spoken, and he had nothing left to say. The drawing room was frozen in silence, the tension heavy enough to strangle breath. The crackle of the fireplace was the only sound that dared to break the stillness, echoing like a taunt in the ears of those seated. Julian Whitmore hadn't moved from his chair. His body remained rigid, as though paralyzed by the shock that had just unfolded around him. His mouth was slightly parted, his eyes darting back and forth as if they could somehow rewrite the words that had just been read aloud. He felt his chest tighten, as though the very foundation beneath him had shifted, leaving him dangling in midair with no ground to land on. For a man who had built his life on control, on dominance, on always being 5 steps ahead, the revelation hit like a thunderclap. The will had not simply divided his world, it had destroyed it in one clean, deliberate sweep. And the most haunting part of all was the clarity with which Eleanor had orchestrated it. Nothing had been left to chance. Every asset, every account, every share, every inch of real estate, gone. Gone to a foundation bearing her name. Gone to a mission greater than vanity. gone to a purpose that transcended him, leaving behind nothing but titles with no power and properties with no access. The million-dollar empire he had once ruled now belonged to an entity that bore his last name but carried none of his essence. The room was still buzzing with disbelief. Some guests whispered, others avoided eye contact altogether. No one wanted to be the one to speak first, to break the moment where Julian sat stripped of his imagined future. Evelyn, meanwhile, stood at the far end of the room, her eyes wild, her hands clenched at her sides. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The color drained from her face as the reality of the situation settled in. She had dressed carefully that day, chosen her earrings with intention, even imagined how she might greet guests as the new woman beside the powerful Whitmore. Now, her world was unraveling faster than she could gather the threads. She knew. Evelyn muttered under her breath, barely audible. She knew exactly what she was doing. Her voice cracked on the last word, not from sadness, but rage. You let this happen, she spat, turning toward Julian. You let her do this. Julian looked at her as though he didn't recognize her. Or maybe he didn't recognize himself anymore. I didn't know, he said again, but the words tasted sour in his mouth. He had said it so many times now it was starting to sound like a confession. You didn't know, Evelyn repeated mockingly. You didn't know she was taking everything while you were off playing house with me? You didn't know she was building a fortress while you were too busy tearing down the life you already had? Her voice had risen now, drawing the attention of those still seated, some of whom stared at her with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. You promised me a future, she said, stepping closer to him. You told me we'd build something together, that she was just a shadow of your past. But look at us now. Look at what she left us. Julian stood slowly, his jaw clenched. You think this is what I wanted? He snapped. You think I planned this? No, Evelyn said sharply. I think you underestimated her. Just like you underestimate everything that isn't wearing a price tag. The words cut deep, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Julian had spent years believing his money, his status, his name were shields against consequence. But none of those could protect him now. Redmond, still standing at the front, cleared his throat. There's one more item, he said. A final letter addressed to Mr. Whitmore, to be read privately. Julian took the envelope reluctantly, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded it. Eleanor's handwriting stared back at him, calm, even, unwavering. Her words were not venomous. They were thoughtful, intentional, layered with both closure and clarity. By the time you read this, the letter began, you will have already realized that the life you thought you controlled was never truly yours. You held the keys to mansions, the titles to empires, but you never held purpose. You mistook possession for power. You mistook affection for obedience. And in doing so, you forgot what it means to build something that outlives you. Julian's breath hitched as he read on. I didn't take anything from you, Julian. I simply reclaimed what I helped create. I gave you my youth, my energy, my trust. And when you discarded me, I chose not to vanish. I chose legacy. The foundation is not revenge. It is redemption. Not for me, but perhaps, in time, for you. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope, his hands trembling. The silence that followed was more suffocating than any accusation. Evelyn, watching him, realized something then. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't about losing access to penthouses and private jets. This was about humiliation. A slow, methodical unraveling of power that left Julian not just penniless, but exposed. Stripped of everything he believed made him who he was. The whispers around them grew louder, the weight of judgment pressing harder. Julian stood in a room full of people who had once admired him, now watching him as though he were some cautionary tale. We should go, he said quietly to Evelyn. But she didn't move. She stared at him, and for the first time, he saw something different in her eyes, disgust. I came here to rise, she said, not to drown with you. And with that, she turned and walked out, heels clicking against the marble floor, her exit echoing louder than any of the words that had just been spoken. Julian didn't follow. He couldn't. His legs felt heavy, his thoughts heavier still. He turned back toward the fire, now nothing more than glowing embers. And for the first time in years, he didn't know what came next. Not because someone had taken his empire, but because he no longer knew who he was without it. The guests began to leave one by one, offering curt nods and empty condolences. Redmond packed the documents and exited quietly, leaving Julian alone in the room, staring into nothing. The foundation was already live. The press would hear by morning. The name Whitmore would still carry weight, but not his. Hers. He sat in the chair, fingers pressed against his temple, the envelope resting on his lap like a stone. Somewhere in that same house, Eleanor's scent still lingered. Her presence remained, not in flesh, but in every corner she had filled with meaning while he had filled his with ego. The millionaire had been dethroned, and what remained was a man with an empty name, staring into the ashes of a fire he no longer knew how to rekindle. The headlines hit the press less than 24 hours after the will was read. Whitmore fortune reassigned. Late wife's foundation claims entire estate. From millionaire to penniless. Julian Whitmore's stunning fall from grace. The widow's legacy leaves lover out in the cold. The stories circulated like wildfire, spreading across business networks, social media, and high society gossip columns. The same circles that had once idolized Julian now buzzed with hushed laughter and disbelief. Reporters camped outside the gates of the estate, hungry for any glimpse of the man who had just lost everything not through scandal, but through calculated silence. But what shocked the world most wasn't the scandal itself. It was how brilliantly Eleanor had done it. There was no courtroom battle, no messy accusations. It was graceful, surgical. She hadn't shouted or sued or retaliated with venom. She had simply rearranged the pieces while Julian was too distracted chasing illusion to notice. Julian spent the next few days locked inside the penthouse, pacing, drinking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He contacted every legal advisor he trusted, only to hear the same response in different words. The foundation structure was ironclad. Contesting it would be futile and would only further damage his public image. The properties had already been legally transferred months ago. The offshore accounts were untouchable. The business shares had been donated to philanthropic arms of the foundation, irrevocable and filed in proper succession. He called Charles, the accountant, desperate to find a loophole, some small error to unravel the nightmare. But there was nothing. Eleanor had built a fortress around her legacy, and he had no keys to the gates. The financial void wasn't the only thing that began to close in around him. Investors started pulling out of deals. Partners canceled meetings. Invitations to exclusive events stopped arriving. The air had shifted, and those who once clung to him now stepped back with polite detachment. No one wanted to be associated with the man who had been outplayed by his dying wife. His name no longer carried weight. It carried caution. Whispers followed him into every room he entered, and even in spaces he once commanded, he now felt like a guest overstaying his welcome. At first, Evelyn stayed. She stood beside him in public, posed for the cameras when necessary, and even offered sympathetic quotes to the media, painting herself as a woman caught in a mess she hadn't asked for. But the cracks in their facade widened quickly. Behind closed doors, their conversations turned bitter. Evelyn's patience wore thin. She had entered his life with dreams of glamour and affluence, not scandal and social exile. "I didn't sign up for this," she snapped one evening, tossing a fashion magazine onto the table. "You said this was temporary, that we'd find a way to fix it." Julian sat in silence, swirling a drink in his hand, his eyes distant. "There's nothing to fix. It's done." Evelyn stood, pacing. "So what now? We just live in the shadow of your dead wife's charity? You think I'm going to spend the rest of my life in a penthouse with empty closets and dwindling bank accounts?" "I never asked you to stay," he replied coldly. "Then maybe I shouldn't," she fired back, her voice sharp. "Because I don't love you, Julian. I loved the life you offered. And now, there's nothing left to love." She packed her things 2 days later and left without a goodbye. The doorman told Julian she didn't even look back. And just like that, he was truly alone. No fortune, no partner, no empire. Just a man standing in the ruins of his former life, haunted by the echo of a woman he had once dismissed as weak. Back at the estate, the foundation launched its first public initiative, a grant for young women in underserved communities, providing scholarships, mentorship programs, and access to resources Eleanor herself had once lacked in her youth. Her story was featured on major networks, not as a tale of pity, but as a beacon of empowerment. The foundation's website published her final letter to the public, a message not of vengeance, but of hope. She spoke of legacy, of love misused, of time reclaimed, and the responsibility to give more than one takes. The public response was overwhelming. Donations poured in. Celebrities endorsed the cause. People who had never heard of Eleanor Whitmore now saw her as a symbol of grace under betrayal, a woman who had turned her suffering into purpose. Julian read the letter more times than he cared to admit. Every line echoed in his mind like a slow-dripping faucet, each word a reminder of what he had overlooked. He stared at her photo on the homepage, her smile soft but certain, and felt something unfamiliar clawing at his chest. It wasn't just regret, it was shame. Real, heavy, paralyzing shame. He tried to write a rebuttal letter to the press, some statement to clarify his position, to defend himself, but the words never came out right. Every draft sounded hollow. Every sentence a justification no one cared to hear. He was irrelevant now, and the worst part was that he knew it. One night, he returned to the estate unannounced, hoping to walk through the garden, to feel something again, anything. But the gates didn't open. A guard informed him politely but firmly that the premises were now restricted to Foundation personnel. He wasn't welcome, not even in the house he had once called home. He drove away in silence, the road stretching endlessly before him, the weight of his mistakes sitting heavy in the passenger seat. In the following weeks, he tried to rebuild. He reached out to old contacts, pitched new ventures, offered consulting services, but the responses were lukewarm at best. His name had become synonymous with disgrace, and though no crime had been committed, the social verdict had already been cast. He moved into a smaller apartment, sold off his remaining cars, liquidated what little remained of his private holdings. He downsized his wardrobe, canceled subscriptions, and for the first time in years, cooked his own meals. He walked the streets unnoticed, the people around him unaware that the man they passed had once owned buildings with his name engraved in gold lettering. He started visiting a small community library every week, partly for the silence, partly because it was the only place where no one asked questions. There, surrounded by dusty shelves and aging paperbacks, he began to read, not market reports or financial journals, but stories. Fiction, biographies, memoirs. He read about failure, redemption, the fragility of ego, the strength of humility. He found himself staring at passages longer than he used to, reflecting more than reacting. And slowly, something inside him began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. One evening, as he walked past a public mural in a city park, he paused. It was a tribute to Eleanor, her face painted in gentle strokes, her eyes looking forward, her foundation's mission written beneath her name. Children played beneath it, unaware of the history, but touched by the legacy. Julian stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, heart beating quietly. He didn't cry. He couldn't. But he did feel. He felt the weight of everything she had left behind. Not the money, not the power, but the impact. And for the first time since it all fell apart, he whispered softly, almost to himself, "You were right." He didn't know what that meant yet. He didn't know if redemption was possible. But for the first time, he wondered if it was worth trying. The scent of fresh paint still lingered faintly in the stairwell of the modest apartment Julian now called home. Gone were the days of doorman and valet service, of sweeping penthouse views and imported Italian marble beneath his feet. The elevator here groaned with age, the walls bore faint scratches, and the mailbox in the lobby stuck if you didn't pull just right. He never imagined his life would come to this, a two-bedroom rental on the edge of downtown, with creaking floorboards and neighbors who didn't recognize his face. No one greeted him with admiration. No one cared that he had once been a millionaire. He was just another man in the hallway now, another name on a lease, another face fading into the background of a city that moved on without him. Mornings had become mechanical. He rose with the alarm, though he rarely slept through the night. Coffee was brewed from a second-hand machine he'd bought online. He ate in silence, the television mumbling in the background more out of habit than interest. His suits, once custom-tailored and meticulously pressed, hung untouched in the closet. These days, he wore jeans and button-downs that didn't quite fit the same. He caught glimpses of himself in the mirror sometimes, unshaven, a little thinner, older somehow, not from age, but from weight. The kind of weight that doesn't rest on your shoulders but settles in your chest, behind your eyes, and never leaves. His days blurred together. A few small consultancy gigs helped cover bills, but nothing brought purpose. His name no longer opened doors, it opened awkward conversations. Most companies preferred to distance themselves from him. His presence wasn't scandalous, it was cautionary. He could still speak with authority, still command a room when he wanted to, but the invitations to those rooms had stopped coming. The most humiliating part wasn't losing the wealth, it was realizing how conditional respect could be. He had built his life on a scaffolding of power and presence, only to watch it all collapse in the absence of true foundation. He often thought of Eleanor now, not just as the woman he betrayed, but as the woman he never fully understood. Her strength hadn't been loud or visible. It had been silent, methodical, strategic in a way that shook him to his core. He remembered her eyes in those final days. Not pleading, not weak, just knowing. She had known everything, and he had seen nothing. One afternoon, a letter arrived in his mailbox, an envelope embossed with the foundation's seal. He turned it over slowly, fingers trembling slightly, hesitant to open it. Inside was a formal notice of a memorial event being hosted in Eleanor's honor, a celebration of her legacy, 1 year after her passing. It included a list of speakers, community leaders, scholarship recipients, and artists inspired by her story. At the bottom of the letter, there was a handwritten note from Meredith. "You don't need to come, but you should." He stared at the letter for a long time before setting it on the table. He didn't know what answer to give. That night, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He wondered how many people in those high-rise buildings knew her name now, how many lives her foundation had touched. He couldn't escape her, not because she haunted him, but because she had risen above him in a way he never imagined possible. 2 days later, he found himself walking past the old estate. The gates remained closed, the new signage clearly marking it as the official headquarters of the Whitmore Legacy Foundation. A security guard eyed him as he approached, and Julian paused just beyond the gate, watching through the iron bars. The gardens had been restored, brighter, more vibrant than he remembered. Children were playing near the fountain, staff members walking in and out of the main building with purpose. A large portrait of Eleanor hung in the foyer, visible even from a distance, her smile captured in a moment that now defined the heart of the entire organization. Julian stood there, hands in his pockets, unsure why he had come. He wasn't seeking redemption. He wasn't even sure he deserved forgiveness. But something inside him needed to see it with his own eyes. What she had built, what she had left behind, what he had thrown away. He turned to leave, but before he could walk away, a soft voice called out behind him. "Mr. Whitmore?" He turned, startled. It was a young woman, no more than 25, holding a clipboard and wearing a foundation badge. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I just thought I recognized you." He nodded awkwardly. "I was just passing by." "You're welcome to come in, if you'd like," she said kindly. "We have tours every afternoon. I can show you around." Julian hesitated. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Eleanor always believed in second chances," she replied, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "She'd want you to see what your name now stands for." The words struck deeper than she could have known. He thanked her politely and walked away, his heart heavier than before. That night, he sat on his couch, the silence in his apartment more deafening than usual. He didn't sleep. He kept thinking about that sentence, "what your name now stands for." The following week, he showed up at the memorial event. He wore a simple suit, no tie, hair neatly combed, shoes polished. He didn't speak. He sat quietly in the last row, unnoticed by most, watching as people celebrated the life of a woman he had once underestimated. He listened as children recited poetry inspired by her letters, as students shared stories about how her scholarships had changed their paths, as community leaders spoke of her impact. There was no bitterness in the air, only admiration, reverence, gratitude. The applause echoed off the marble walls, and Julian found himself clapping too, his hands slow but steady. At the end of the event, he approached Meredith. She turned and looked at him for a long moment, then nodded gently. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Forgiveness didn't always require conversation. Sometimes, it just required presence. As he walked home that evening, he passed the mural again. A new quote had been added beneath Eleanor's portrait. Legacy is not what we leave in our name, but what we leave in others. He stood there, reading it again and again, letting the weight of those words settle into him. He didn't know what the next chapter of his life would be. He didn't have a plan. But for the first time in a long time, he knew he wanted to try to become something more than what he had been. He wanted to deserve the name that now lived not in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in hope, in education, in change. And that, he thought, might be the cost of betrayal, not just the loss of wealth or reputation, but the journey back to meaning. A journey he now walked alone, but finally, with purpose. The city moved forward with its usual rhythm, but for Julian, each step outside his apartment felt like walking through a world that no longer belonged to him. People rushed by, faces buried in screens, voices echoing through busy intersections, but none of it seemed to touch him. He moved through the noise unnoticed, unseen, a ghost of his former self drifting through the crowd. But something had shifted within him since the memorial. It was subtle, barely discernible to the outside world, but inside, something had stirred. It wasn't peace. Not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. He couldn't stop thinking about that quote on the mural, "What we leave in others." It clung to his thoughts like a whisper that wouldn't fade. Julian had started volunteering at a local community center, not because he had anything to offer, at least, not in the way he used to, but because he needed to be somewhere that didn't measure him by his bank account. He helped organize supplies, ran errands, stocked shelves, and occasionally tutored young students in business fundamentals. The first time he explained profit margins to a group of high schoolers, he realized how much he still knew, and how little he had ever shared. The kids didn't care about his last name or the scandal. They listened because he spoke with patience, because he answered questions without arrogance, because he showed up. And that, for now, was enough. He hadn't been back to the foundation headquarters since the memorial, but he followed its progress religiously. Every article, every broadcast, every social media post about new initiatives reached him. He read about the literacy programs, the scholarship endowments, the wellness clinics in underserved neighborhoods, and the leadership workshops designed for women who had once been told they didn't belong in rooms of power. Eleanor's name had become synonymous with transformation, not because of how she died, but because of how she chose to live in her final days. And the foundation, now thriving beyond what anyone imagined, was the embodiment of her spirit. The board had expanded. Corporate sponsors had joined. A satellite branch had opened in another city. Her vision wasn't just surviving, it was multiplying. Julian often watched interviews with foundation staff. He listened to the stories of people whose lives had been changed by programs he had never even heard of during his time in the mansion. He watched a single mother describe how the foundation gave her the tools to start her own business. He listened as a teenage girl shared her story of escaping an abusive home and finding safety through a shelter funded by Eleanor's grant. He read letters in newspapers from people who had never met Eleanor, but said they now lived differently because of her message. And each time, Julian felt something unfamiliar, a quiet awe, a bittersweet pride wrapped in sorrow. He had once thought legacy was about building towers. She had shown him that it was about building people. He received an unexpected invitation one afternoon, an opening ceremony for a new vocational training center named after Eleanor. It wasn't a personal invitation, but a public one, addressed to past contributors, supporters, and members of the community. He debated whether to go. He didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable, didn't want to cast a shadow on something meant to be celebratory. But a part of him needed to see it, to witness one more ripple from the stone she had cast. He arrived early, wearing the same modest suit he had worn at the memorial. The center was a modest building on the outside, but inside it buzzed with energy, colorful walls, classrooms filled with tools and resources, instructors preparing materials, students already gathered in groups. A young coordinator handed him a program pamphlet and smiled warmly, not recognizing him. He was just another face in the crowd again. He wandered through the hallways slowly, reading the mission statements on the walls, looking at the photo galleries of past graduates, staff members, and community leaders. At the center of the main hallway was a large portrait of Eleanor, this time different from the ones he had seen before. It wasn't posed or polished. It was candid, her sitting in the sunroom, laughing mid-conversation, a cup of tea in hand, eyes crinkled with joy. It wasn't a portrait of a martyr. It was a woman who had lived and left behind something real. A small group of children walked past him, laughing, holding notebooks and bouncing between topics like only children could. One of them stopped briefly and stared at the portrait. "That's the lady who made this place," she said to the others. "She was really kind. My mom said she helped people who no one else helped." Julian stood still, his chest tightening. The girl didn't know him. She didn't know the history, the betrayal, the downfall. She just knew the kindness that lingered in Eleanor's legacy. And somehow, that made all the difference. After the opening speeches, Julian quietly slipped out before anyone could notice him. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need thanks. He just needed that moment, that small reminder that impact doesn't always come from power, but from presence. As he walked home through the city, the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting golden streaks on the pavement. He passed a street vendor playing a soft tune on an old saxophone, children chasing each other along the sidewalk, a couple arguing about directions with playful frustration. Life was moving forward. At home, Julian opened the journal he had begun weeks ago. It was something Clara had given him after Eleanor's funeral, telling him that healing sometimes needed space to land. He had scribbled in it sporadically, thoughts, regrets, fragments of conversations he wished he'd had. But now, he opened a fresh page and began to write something new. Not about the past, but about what he wanted to do next. Not about redemption, but about contribution. He didn't know how far he'd go. He didn't know if it would ever balance the scales. But for once, he wasn't chasing absolution. He was chasing meaning. Later that week, he returned to the community center and offered to design a financial literacy program for at-risk youth. The director agreed, surprised but grateful. Julian spent his evenings developing materials, pulling from years of experience he once hoarded for boardrooms and now offered to classrooms. The kids responded. They asked questions, challenged his ideas, built mock businesses, and learned what it meant to not just earn, but to manage, to protect, to grow. One afternoon, a boy stayed behind after class and said, "I used to think people like you didn't care about people like us." Julian smiled softly. "I used to think a lot of wrong things too." And in that small exchange, he saw the beginning of a different kind of legacy, one not born from fortune, but from failure, humility, and the quiet rebuilding of something worthwhile. It didn't carry his name on a plaque, but maybe, just maybe, it would carry his purpose in someone else's hands. The mornings had grown colder, not in the way that forced people to bundle up in heavy coats, but in the way that seemed to settle into the bones, quietly reminding the city that seasons change, whether anyone is ready or not. Julian had grown used to walking early, long before the sidewalks became crowded and before the traffic turned the streets into rivers of noise. He liked the quiet. He liked the anonymity. No one stopped him anymore. No one recognized him as the man whose face once appeared on magazine covers or as the name that once echoed through corporate circles. He was just another man with a coffee cup in one hand and a second-hand jacket zipped to the collar. The community center had become a second home. The people there knew him only by his first name, and they judged him not by his past, but by his presence. He showed up. He worked. He taught. The financial literacy program he had started grew steadily. New faces came each week, single mothers, high school dropouts, immigrants trying to understand a system that was never designed with them in mind. Julian taught them the fundamentals: budgeting, saving, credit, investment. But what he taught most was confidence. He showed them how to ask questions, how to not be intimidated by terms designed to exclude them, how to take control of the numbers that controlled their lives. And with every lesson, he felt something shift inside him, not dramatically, but deeply, like soil turning beneath the surface. He still thought about Eleanor. Every day, not as a ghost, not as guilt, but as something steadier, like a heartbeat, a quiet reminder that legacy was never about wealth. He sometimes reread the letter she had left for him, not to punish himself, but to stay grounded. Her words, etched in careful ink, reminded him not to forget who he had been, but more importantly, who he could still become. He often wondered what she would think of him now. Would she believe the change was real? Would she see through his actions and find sincerity? Or would she simply smile, knowing he had finally arrived at a place she always hoped he would reach? One afternoon, while preparing materials for a class, he received a call from a private number. It was a board member from the Whitmore Legacy Foundation. They were launching a new branch focused on economic empowerment, and they wanted to consult him. "We know the history," the woman said gently, not avoiding the truth. "But we also know what you've been doing quietly. Your work hasn't gone unnoticed." Julian sat silently, unsure what to say. "We're not asking you to join the board. Not yet. Just contribute. Share what you know. Help shape the curriculum. Your experience still matters, even if it came at a cost." He accepted the invitation, not for recognition, not for redemption, but because for the first time in a long while, he felt useful in a way that didn't involve money or status. He met with the team, reviewed their frameworks, offered insights, and slowly, over several months, became a fixture in a project he had once believed belonged only to someone else. He wasn't the face of it. He wasn't in the press releases. He didn't ask for credit. But he was there, working behind the scenes, contributing to the legacy he had once tried to erase. He visited the new training centers, spoke to instructors, coached students, and even trained volunteers. Each time he walked into one of those buildings, he carried both pride and pain. And perhaps that was the balance he needed. It wasn't easy. Some people still looked at him with skepticism. Others whispered. But most simply appreciated his presence, his knowledge, and his willingness to serve without ego. He didn't try to erase his past anymore. He carried it like a scar, visible, but no longer defining. He learned to coexist with regret without letting it become a prison. And in doing so, he found a new kind of freedom, one that came not from reinvention, but from acceptance. Months passed, and one day, a letter arrived in his mailbox. It was from Clara. She had retired recently and moved to a small coastal town. Her letter was warm, filled with updates and memories, and at the bottom, she wrote a single line that stayed with him. "She would have been proud of the man you're becoming." He folded the letter and placed it in the back of his journal, next to Eleanor's. Not because he needed constant reminders, but because they had become part of his story now, not chapters he could skip, but pages he would never want to forget. One late afternoon, Julian returned to the cemetery. It had been almost 2 years since the funeral, and he had only visited once, quietly, without ceremony. This time, he brought flowers, simple white lilies, her favorite. He walked through the narrow gravel path, past rows of polished headstones, until he reached hers. The headstone was elegant, understated, carved with care. No grand inscriptions, no elaborate tributes. Just her name, her dates, and a single phrase beneath. She lived with grace and left with purpose. He stood there in silence, the breeze rustling the trees overhead. He didn't speak at first. He just stood, letting the stillness settle around him. Then, finally, he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but simply. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not just for what I did, but for not seeing you sooner. For not knowing what I had until it was gone. For thinking love was measured in comfort and not in courage." His voice cracked, but he kept going. "You didn't just build a foundation for others. You built one for me too. I just took longer to find it." He placed the flowers gently at the base of the stone, then sat on the bench nearby. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. He didn't feel lonely. He didn't feel punished. He felt something else entirely. Peace. A fragile, imperfect peace, born not from resolution, but from the acceptance of every broken piece of the story that had led him here. And as he stood to leave, he looked back once more, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. Because in the end, it wasn't just Eleanor who had built something beautiful. He had, too, in his own quiet way, in his own slow redemption, in the spaces where regret and purpose met. And for a man who had once thought legacy was measured in balance sheets, he now knew better. Legacy was built in the lives you touch when you least expect it, in the work you do when no one is watching, in the people who say your name not because of what you owned, but because of how you made them feel seen. That was the true cost of betrayal, but also, perhaps, its most precious gift.